text is really the beginning of the fourth chapter, a familiar text about the sower, but I'd like to set it up by reading a few verses at the end of the third chapter. Do you listen for a word that Spirit brings to you from this text of long ago? Jesus went home, and the crowd came together again so that he couldn't even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he's gone out of his mind. Again, he began to teach beside the sea, and such a very large crowd gathered around him that he needed to get into a boat on the sea so he could sit there and teach. The whole crowd was beside him on the land, and he began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on a path. Birds came up and ate it. Some seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. When the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it just withered away. Another seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it off, and it yielded no grain. And other seed fell into good soil. It brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and an unbelievable 100-fold. And Jesus said, "Let anyone with ears listen." When he was alone with those who were around him, along with the 12, they asked him about the parables. And he said, do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand any of the parables? The sower sows the word. There are ones on the path where the word is sown, and when they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. There are ones that are sown on the rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they do not have any root, and they endure only for a little while. And then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are sown among the thorns, and these are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke off that word, and it yields nothing. And then there are the ones who are sown on good soil. They hear the word, they accept it, and they bear fruit, 30, 60, and 100-fold. Hear what the Spirit might say to our church. Is the faith that we have, that we share together, that engagement we have with God, is it enough? Is our engagement enough? Enough for what, you might ask? Well, enough to meet us at the moments when we despair. At the the moment that we despair, does that faith fill us and give us enough hope so that we can weep with huge tears? Do we have enough faith to work tirelessly towards the justice of the world without losing hope and energy and falling into cynicism? Heard Gwen Ifill speak last week at the Marin Speakers Series, and she talked about how difficult it was for her to do her job without falling into cynicism, to keep the optimism in the face of politics. Is our faith enough? I mean, in this congregation, now, I have some question as to whether it is, but I want to be clear that I'm not condemning anybody here. I'm not trying to be critical, really. I'm trying to point something out that I think we all need to pay attention to, including me. Does our faith have the kind of substance and character that can meet us in those difficult times? I've been here for 6.5 years. And there's something that I've noticed. And that is that when people are in trouble, when people meet tragedy, when people are afraid, they want me to keep it a secret. I mean it. We've got a ton of people here willing to help, and nobody here willing to accept it. There's a sense in which we just pull back It's like we can't weep, explode into those tears and expressions of fear when we're with one another. Is our faith enough? It isolates us one from another. We also, on Wednesday night, we looked at a film, a TED Talk from Brene Brown. I've now found out it's Brene. I know that because I heard her say it. And she talked about why it is that people get isolated one from another. And I think there's some isolation here. And at the root of it is shame, a very dangerous topic to preach about because it brings up awful emotions. The emotions that will do anything to numb and settle down. It's shame, a sense that we are not enough. I am not enough to be able to expose who I am to you and expect that I will be loved. I'm unworthy. That's the feeling of shame. Something about you, something that's going on, some flaw that makes you feel ashamed and keeps us isolated. And we try and build ourselves up and we try and ignore it actually a lot of the time. But you know, all that internal stuff, all those strokes, they don't seem to work really very well. So we numb. I mean, me, for example. What do I need to do to feel worthwhile and worthy? Well, given the construct of my upbringing, where I was competing with Jesus every day of my life, in order for me to feel worthwhile, I will have to start a major world religion. And even then, I won't be around to enjoy the feeling that I'm enough because it takes a couple of thousand years to see if it sticks around. We can't feel like we're enough. I mean, if we're working our way to it, if we're, looking out to grab for it in some way, we carry those feelings and it keeps us from being with one another. Sometimes the reason we don't share what's at the depth of our hearts, the fear that we don't matter, is because we wonder if people will be able to stand it. If you're among people, if you're afraid they're going to turn you away at those moments, then you can't open up. You can't touch one another's hearts, and that worries me. I mean, we preach here and talk about a God that meets each and every one of us with the starting point that you are enough. Doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter who you think you are. It doesn't matter whether you think you have fallen, not accomplished what you need to do. God starts with you're enough. And God's power works on us from that point forward. It's in the nature of things. Can you hear that word, you're enough? Because it's from that place that we can feel into the life that we live. It's from that place that we can work into the life that we have. It's in that place that we can love one another and not protect ourselves to the point that we become isolated one from another. Is our faith enough for that? I kind of don't think so. I kind of don't think so. I think there are reasons for it. I observed something in a conversation we had with the session the other night, but I'd like to make it really clear. I have had so many conversations with so many what I'd call liberal Christians over the years that this is just representative of the entire liberal Christendom. Okay? Why are you a Christian? Was the question that was asked, and the answers we got from wonderful, generous-hearted people, let me be clear. Everybody else said, no, you understand, right? They're serving, and from generous-hearted people was, well, I was born a Christian, so I guess that's why I became a Christian. Or I met somebody whose father was a Christian and I liked him, and well, when we had a family, we came to church, so that's why I'm a Christian. I like the values. I'm interested in following Jesus, because Jesus encourages us to love one another. Is this kind of engagement with the power and the face of God enough to meet us in the moments of despair when we have to weep before we can get to joy? When we have to work in the face of disappointment all around us? Is that enough? I don't think so. And it worries me. And believe me, it's not just here. And it's all of us, not you, while I have a great engagement. The trouble with faith, the trouble with the way it works in a community, is that we either help each other to move our faith up, to be a deeper and deeper engagement with God, or we make it harder for one another to do it. It's the nature of a corporate faith. It's why the Bible talks all the time about the history of Israel, that never thinks about individuals in the nation, always about the whole. I think there are reasons for it, though. There are reasons we're in the place we are. Really, the whole mainline church, it's the reason we're dying. We, in what are typically thought of as liberal mainline churches, have deconstructed the magic God. We don't have him anymore. We might try to use the language, but mostly we don't have the magic God anymore. We don't really think that if we just talk to some outside force, somehow magically things that weren't going to happen will happen. Mostly in the liberal church, we've deconstructed this God, and what have we ended up with? We've ended up with Jesus, who we can follow because he tells us to love one another. But a God who can meet us at the moment of our despair, in the moment of our exhaustion, in the face of the work in this world? No. I think we lost that when we get deconstructed. There's going to need to be some faith constructed beyond that. Some way of saying that the people who wrote the scriptures that engaged God and talked about a God up there that was involved in their lives, they knew it didn't work like magic. Some way to construct it that we know that they were pointing at something real. They engaged a God that we wouldn't describe that way, but that was real for them. A God that acts in their lives, a God that met them in the midst of despair. Next week, Sharon's going to preach. She's going to preach on a psalm. It's a lament psalm. The psalmist knew a God that met him in despair. But we've lost that. And the other thing that I heard when we were talking about why am I a Christian is a lack of comfort about saying I'm a Christian. Why? Well, because if I say I'm a Christian, aren't I saying that Christians are right and other people are wrong? So let's see how this works. See if I can't construct something beyond that idea. I am a Christian. I'm digging deep right here, living in those texts, trying to understand what they point at, because I believe they unfold a beautiful picture of the truth of a God whose grace comes first in our lives, unfolds each and every day in our lives. I'm a Christian. My friend Sally Kempton, don't know if any of you have read her. She's not a Christian. She's Hindu or post-Hindu. Zion's mother, Hindu. My friend Mark, Jewish. There are all these people that engage a different kind of faith that isn't Christian. Are they wrong? Absolutely not. I just named you three people who have a huge influence on my Christian faith. There's a way to be Christian without saying others are wrong. No reason to be afraid to grab hold and say, I need a deep and profound engagement with this faith so that I can be met in the moment of despair. I can weep in the moment of despair knowing that hope will rise. I can work against all odds in a world that seems to be tearing itself apart without being a cynic, because I know the power of God will unfold from within. I never sung that hymn or heard that hymn. Jan found it. May have seemed like unusual lyrics, but it was quite remarkable. It painted a picture of a God that unfolds within the creation. Don't have to deny science. We pick it up and we recognize the power of God unfolds within it. Is our faith enough? When Jesus taught this parable, he was teaching to a group of people for whom their faith was no longer enough. Different reasons. It wasn't a deconstruction exactly of the faith. It wasn't a moment where they felt like they couldn't be Jewish, for instance, because, that wouldn't be right. No, it was the power of Rome that had absolutely smashed their identity. It was the power of the religious authorities that took away anything that remotely resembled freedom for the peasants. Now, there were reasons the faith had become not enough. And what Jesus said was that the reign of God is this close. It's right in front of your face. The seeds of the word, the creative power of God that carries us into hope, that carries us into the morning of joy, the seeds are planted in each and every heart. Question is, will you till the soil? The seeds that are planted on the path, they can be turned in. You can turn that soil over. The seeds that are planted in the thorns, you can turn that soil over. Even the seeds that are planted in the rock, you pound away until you find some soil and some water that will make it grow. Jesus understood that they needed an engagement with the presence of God that would allow them to be filled in the moment of despair. And in the moment when they felt like there was no step forward that could bring them anything good. That's the faith we believe. But it takes an embrace. It takes a letting go of this sense that I can't make claims on truth. It takes a letting go of that sense that just because God isn't magic, it doesn't mean that God isn't active. We open our hearts and we look for the presence of God unfolding and operating in this world, and we will see it. And we help one another see it. Each time we share the moment of shame, each time we share the moment of despair. I think the church is dying for a lack of engagement with this God. I think we begin to take hold of that, and we have a community not of secrets, but of an open-hearted acceptance of what happens in life. I think we don't worry about the budget anymore. I think there's hope in the midst of that, because it is in the nature of God to make this world, this community, these hearts, all of them, be made whole, filled with hope and filled with joy. So, is your faith